Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the chapter 23 homework from the McGraw-Hill textbook. And chapter 23 primarily deals with making decisions using accounting information. So in chapter 23, what we're really looking at are what we call relevant costing for managerial decisions. Okay? And as part of that, I'm going to kind of take you through a few concepts that we need to talk about before we really dig into the homework, and then we'll get into the problems, and it'll help speed us up later because we won't have to take as much time to explain certain concepts and certain ideas if we go ahead and do that up front. So, the first thing we need to talk about is what does it mean for a cost to be relevant? Well, for a cost to be relevant, it must change. So, the cost will change with the decision selected, or as a result of the decision that was selected. So what that tells me is that if a cost is going to stay the same between multiple alternatives, that cost is not relevant to the decision process. So what we need to look at then are two different things. We need to look at what are called incremental costs. And what an incremental cost is it is an additional cost, so I'm going to abbreviate that, an additional cost incurred as a result of the alternative selected. The second piece we need to talk about is what is called an incremental revenue. So an incremental revenue, I'm going to abbreviate revenue, REV. Okay, so we got incremental cost and incremental revenue. And this is additional revenue that is generated by selecting one course of action over another. Okay. Now, since we've discussed that, we can move on and talk about different types of costs that we're going to see discussed in this chapter. So the first of these is what we call a sunk cost. And the first thing that we need to talk about with regard to sunk cost is that these arise from past transactions. And can not be changed, avoided, or changed. Okay? So, when we think about relevant versus non-relevant, then these right here are not relevant. And that is our sunk cost. The second type of cost is what we call an out-of-pocket cost. And an out-of-pocket cost requires a future outlay of cash. So a future outlay of cash, that will change based on the decision we select, because if we select to purchase something versus not purchasing something, then we will see that there's a different amount of cash required to purchase something than to not purchase that item. So we see that is our out-of-pocket cost. An example here would be something like the decision to buy new equipment. If you purchase the new equipment, you'll have an outlay of cash. And if you don't purchase the new equipment, there will be no outlay of cash. Now, the third type of cost we need to look at is what is called an opportunity cost. So an opportunity cost tells us this is the potential benefit that is lost because we selected one course of action over another course of action. Now, example here. Assume you are coming to college full-time. You're taking 12 or 15 hours this semester. And instead of being able to work full-time and say work 50 or 60 hours a week, if your job needed you to do that, you are now having to come to class. Well, the hours that you lost at your job would represent an opportunity cost to getting that education, because the total cost of that education then includes the hours that you had to give up at work. So an example would be hours lost at work to attend classes. Okay. And I just realized I actually didn't provide you any examples of sunk costs. So I'm going to hop back up here. I'm going to do it in a different color just so it'll stand out a little bit, since I'm kind of squeezing it in here. So I'll do it in green. So an example of your sunk cost then is the cost of previously purchased equipment. So what I mean here is, when we're making the decision to purchase new equipment, it does not matter to us how much we paid for the old equipment if we are thinking rationally. Now, typically, what'll end up happening is people will say, no, we paid $10 million for that piece of equipment. We want to make sure we get our money's worth. And that's fine. But if that machine is not working out, the cost we paid for it really shouldn't factor into this next decision, because we need to be thinking clearly and making sure that we're making decisions that make the most sense. So that's what we want to look at there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clear out this page, and we're going to move on to some other discussions. And we're going to look at the main focus of this chapter, which is dealing with different types of decisions. So the main focus of this chapter will be this: the types of decisions that we are about to discuss. So the first one that we want to look at is what is called a make or buy decision. And a make or buy decision is exactly what it sounds like. We're trying to decide, do we want to make this component or do we want to buy this component? So the first thing I would tell you is to be very careful here. So be careful. So the reason you need to be careful is that you only include what are called the incremental costs when making this decision. So you say, well, what would that be? And what I would tell you is that this is a couple of things. This could include the direct materials associated with making this, because if you didn't make it, you wouldn't need those direct materials. The direct labor associated with this. Any additional supplies that may be necessary. Any additional cleanup costs that may arise out of this. Any additional quality control. There's all kinds of different stuff that could fall into this. But anything that is arising because we are now deciding to make this product, that will have to be factored in as part of these incremental costs. What we want to make sure we don't do is assign costs that would have been incurred anyway, because that could skew our decision and lead us to make the wrong choice. So we want to make sure we don't do that. So you say, well, that's great, and that's a lot of stuff, but is there a simple way to remember this? Is there a simple way to know what to do? And the answer is yes. And so I'm going to write this decision rule in green. So the decision rule that you need to know is that if incremental cost are less than the cost to buy, then you will make the product. Because you're saying the incremental cost of making this is less than the price you would charge me to buy it, well then I want to go ahead and make that item. However, if the incremental cost are greater than my cost to buy, then I want to buy the product. Now, for each one of these decisions that we're going to talk about, there are additional considerations that need to be considered. I'm not going to discuss those. They are in the textbook, so I would ask you to go back and just read those just 1 or 2 paragraphs after each decision, just to make sure you get the full picture. But for the sake of conciseness and for keeping these videos to a more reasonable length, I'm going to try to not go into all the additional examples and additional considerations. But you could see 1 or 2 questions on those pop up on your exam, so I would strongly suggest you go just read through that. It's not a ton of reading. Just as you're reading through the chapter, pay extra attention to those extra considerations. Okay, and that takes us through to the end of the first type of decision. The second type of decision deals with, should we sell a product as it is, or should we process further? So one example of this is if you, for example, are a peanut farmer. If you're a peanut farmer, can you sell just your peanuts? Absolutely. But could you process that into peanut butter or some kind of other item using peanuts? Of course you could. So the question here is, well, how would you decide which way you want to sell this? So what I'm going to tell you to do here is, first, you're going to take your incremental revenue. So incremental revenue minus the incremental cost and that will give you what is called the incremental income for each alternative. Okay. Now, once you've done that, what our decision rule tells us, so DR is for decision rule, is this is how we're going to make that decision at the end of this, is we are going to select the alternative with the highest incremental income. Okay, so be careful here. Don't be fooled into saying with the highest incremental revenue, because incremental revenue is just this top piece right here. We then have to consider the cost to actually transform this peanut into peanut butter, for example. So we can't forget about the incremental cost. And once we net those two out, we will come down to what actually is helping us make this decision, which is that incremental income. Okay, so very good. And that'll take us through to the end of the second type of decision. So I'm going to clear out this page one more time. We'll go back into it and we'll talk about another type of decision here. And this decision is number 3, and it is called scrap or rework. So, inevitably during production, certain pieces of product will not meet the quality standards that we set for ourselves. And now management has a decision to make. Do we try to sell those as they are, or scrap them, throw them away, maybe only get 10% what they would have been worth, or maybe nothing? Or do we want to go in and actually correct the work on these products and then sell them at hopefully full price? So this is the decision that we're going to have to look at. So the way I'm going to tell you to work out this one is you're going to take what is called the sales price of the scrap material, or the reworked units, right? Because you'll have to calculate it both ways. So I'm just going to write it as one line, right? If you were looking at the scrapped piece, you would take the sales price of the scrapped. And if you were looking at the reworked units, then you would take the sales price of the completed proper unit. Then you'll back out your less, right? Your out-of-pocket cost. To rework defective product. Okay, so DEF is defective and PROD is for product. And that will give you the incremental income per unit. Now, just like we did in the top line here with that sales price, the same thing is true for the second line, which is these out-of-pocket costs. Now, for the out-of-pocket costs, you're going to have 0 out-of-pocket costs if you're scrapping it because you're not fixing it, right? So it'll just be the sales price of the scrap minus 0 will give you your incremental income. And then for the reworked product, you will take the reworked selling price less the out-of-pocket cost to fix that product, and that will give you the incremental income per unit. Now, the decision rule that we need to use here is going to tell me that we will choose whichever, and by that, of course, I mean to scrap or rework, but choose whichever has the higher incremental income. And once again, make sure you don't just say the incremental revenue, because of course the reworked unit will have higher incremental revenue because we're going to be able to sell it at a higher price. This is the incremental income that we need to make sure that we are making the best overall decision. Okay. Now that takes us through the first 3 items. Now we're going to look at the 4th type of decision. And this 4th type of decision that we're going to look at is how do we determine sales mix? So you say, well, we've got maybe 3 products that we make. How do we determine if we have a constrained resource, which ones we make? So more than this, it's not really just sales mix. It is what we call sales mix with constrained resources. So sales mix with constrained resources. And what I'm going to have to do is come in and first take my selling price minus my variable costs. And that will give me, of course, what we've seen all semester, which is contribution margin per unit. Now, I will do this for each product I make, right? So if I have 3 products, I'll do selling price of product 1 minus variable cost of product 1. That'll give me contribution margin per unit of product 1. Then I'll do the same thing for product 2 and the same thing for product 3, okay? Now, if you just stop here, you could make the wrong decision. And that's because what if I'm using 3 units of the scarce resource for product 1, but I only use 1 unit of the scarce resource for product 2? Well, if my income is only twice as much for product 1, then I might be better off making product 2 because that ratio works out better. Don't worry about it right now. We'll see that in the actual problems, but I just want to bring it to your attention. So now we know we can't stop right here. So you say, well, then what step has to happen after this? Well, after you've calculated the contribution margin per unit, you then need to divide that by the amount of constrained resource used. So for example, if you were trying to make tires and you were trying to do that with rubber, then if 1 tire required 10 pounds of rubber, then you would divide that by 10 pounds. And if another tire required 12 pounds of rubber, you would divide that one by 12 pounds, okay? So we're just using whatever that constraint or that limited resource, that quantity that was used is what we're dividing by. Now, once we've done that, then we get what we actually need, which is my contribution margin per unit. But it's a little bit different because it's not just contribution margin per unit that we saw above, but it's per unit of that constrained resource. So what I'm going to do now is when I'm receiving orders from customers and I've got a limited amount of rubber in this case for tires, what I'll have to do is say, well, which one of these gives me the highest contribution margin per unit of rubber, per pound of rubber? Then I will fill orders all the way as much as I can on whatever that order is that has the highest contribution margin per pound of rubber. Then I'll fill all the orders with that second one all the way until I run out, right? So if there's sufficient demand for the product that has the highest contribution margin per unit of rubber, then I should only produce that one product. But if demand on that product is limited, then I should move to the second highest. And if demand on that product is limited, then I should move to the third highest, right? So we want to fill as many orders as we can. We want to make sure we're using all of this, but we want to make sure we're doing it in a way that gives us the ability to maximize the resources at our disposal. And that's exactly what we see here. Now, for the next one, so I guess I should jot down that decision rule real quick. So here, the decision rule for number 4 says that we fill orders of product with the highest contribution margin per unit of constrained resource. First, and then you'll just go down the line, right? So you'll rank them. This one has the highest possible contribution margin per unit of that constrained resource that we can produce. And then we'll move on to the second. Then we'll move on to the third. And we'll just move on through it like so. Now, we're going to clear this page one more time. And we're going to go right back into it. So, for the next one, I believe this will be number 5. What we're going to look at is segment elimination. And we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but here we're going to look at it a little bit differently. So, in the past, we looked at this very briefly in a prior chapter, but today we're going to see how we're going to make this decision and what else we might need to consider. So, in the past, what we said was that a segment with revenue less than direct cost is a candidate for segment elimination. And that's what we said in the past, and that was okay. And it's true to some extent. However, if we really want to make sure we're making a good decision, there's a little bit more we've got to look at. So in this case, we have to look at what are called avoidable expenses. So avoidable expenses and unavoidable expenses. So what this is going to tell me is if I can avoid that cost, then eliminating the line will save me that portion of money. But the portion that cannot be avoided is going to occur regardless. And so we'll just jot that down. So avoidable expenses, these are able to be avoided if segment is eliminated. Unavoidable expenses, on the other hand, these cannot be avoided and will continue. So these are amounts that will continue even if the segment is eliminated. So we can't shut down a segment because these unavoidable expenses are making it unprofitable, because if we do, we'll actually end up hurting ourselves, because now any income that was generating to help offset some of those unavoidable expenses, we're now going to lose. Those unavoidable expenses are just going to keep on hitting. So we want to make sure we don't make that kind of decision. So instead, the decision rule that we're going to see here is going to tell me that the decision rule is a segment, that a segment is a candidate for elimination if its revenues are less than its avoidable expenses. So if I am making less in revenue than the expenses that I can save by shutting this segment, I should definitely shut down this segment. However, if I'm at least making enough in revenue to cover those avoidable expenses, then some money is being put towards covering these unavoidable expenses. What that means is the company would actually be worse off by shutting this non-profitable segment, because we would now have to pay for those unavoidable expenses without the addition of that revenue from this non-profitable segment. Okay. Now, last time, hopefully, we'll have to clear this out. And that is to discuss what we're going to do as the last decision, which is a keep or replace decision. So we've got some equipment, it's working, but we've heard there's this better piece of machinery that could save us some money. And we want to see, should we purchase this new equipment and have these cost savings, or should we continue using the old equipment? And so that's what we're going to look at here. So if the reduction, so in this case, I'm just going to jump straight to the decision rule because it just makes more sense that way. And then we'll look at, I believe, a question in the homework that actually handles this. But here, my decision rule is going to tell me that if the reduction in variable manufacturing costs is greater than the net cost to buy the new machine, then we will buy the machine. And that's because the machine is actually cheaper than continuing to do business the old way, which means I would be making a better decision by choosing to get rid of that old machine and purchase the new machine. I want to look at one thing with you real quick. If you notice, in this decision rule, I said if the reduction in variable manufacturing cost is greater than the net cost to buy the new machine. I did not say greater than the gross cost to buy that machine. You say, well, what's the difference? Well, the net cost to buy that machine is calculated as the gross cost, so gross cost of machine, or of piece of equipment, or whatever you're looking at, minus any trade-in value for old machine. That gives me my net cost to buy the machine. So what that tells me then is, for example, if I had a new machine I was looking at buying, and say it was $200,000. Well, that's the gross cost of that machine. But what if the old machine I had was still in pretty good shape and they were willing to give me $75,000 for that machine? Well, the net cost then is only the difference between those two, which is just $125,000. And that's all there is to this. So hopefully not too terrible on that keep or replace decision, but we will be looking at one in the homework. Now, the very last piece that we've got to look at are what we call the pricing decisions. So basically, there is a type of pricing that is called cost plus pricing. What you need to know here is that this is used when firms are price setters. So when firms are price setters is when we can use the cost plus method of setting these prices. So what that means then is that I want to come in here and analyze how much it costs me to make this good, and then charge a percentage more than that I choose to determine my profit. So I say, it might cost me $100 to make this piece of machinery or this piece of product for my customers, and I want a 20% profit. If that is the case, then the amount that I will record for my selling price will be the $100 that it cost me plus the 20% profit margin to bring me to a total of $120. And this is one way a firm can determine price. But you notice, this is when firms are price setters. And you say, well, what does it mean for a firm to be a price setter? And this is when you've got a firm that can pretty much charge what they want within reason. So, for example, around the time when Apple first really got big, they had pretty much a lock on the smartphone market. If you wanted a smartphone at that time, you had to pay what Apple said you had to pay. However, now that has changed some. Apple is no longer quite in such a strong position because we now have Android and other businesses that are actually stepping in to fill this. And so now they're losing a little bit of that control in that market. They still exercise a fair bit of this price setting ability, but definitely not to the extent they did when they first came onto the market. Now, the next type of pricing is what we call target costing. And this is when firms are price takers. And it's pretty much what it sounds like, and it's the opposite of being a price setter. In this case, the firm does not have a strong hold on the market. There are many people competing in this market, selling basically the same product. And so the firm does not have a whole lot of room to manage price. What they can adjust is cost. So in this case, the firm must determine how much in profit they want to make and then back into the cost they have to hit, because they're not going to be able to change that price very much. So if I know I want a 20% profit, and I know that it right now costs me $100 to make that, but I know customers are not willing to pay $120, I must figure out the cost that I have to hit that, when increased by 20%, hits say $115, which customers might be willing to pay. So it's a little bit different direction, but it's the same goal. We're still trying to figure out how to get that amount of profit that we are aiming for. Are there other methods? There are absolutely other methods. The other methods I would ask you to read about in the textbook. They're not super important to this class, but I would like you to at least be aware of these other pricing methods. Okay, and that's it. So that covers kind of the theory for this chapter, and hopefully this is a kind of good introduction to what we're about to get into with the actual Chapter 23 homework. So stick around for the next video if you want to see the homework, and thank you. We'll see you next time.